Hey guys, welcome back to Fast Keto. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Ben Bikman joining us for the third time on Fast Keto. And today we talked all about gluconeogenesis, advantages of incorporating healthy fats into your diet with protein, the best combinations of macronutrients to burn fat, optimize your body composition, why the body wastes fat in the form of ketones, why and how the body's metabolic rate is actually higher when insulin is lower. We talked about so many fantastic topics today, and I know you guys are going to love this episode. And we also got to talk about Dr. Ben Bikman's brand new book, which is available for pre-order, and I will have all of the links to that in the show notes if you want to check out his new book as well. So really great to have Dr. Bikman back with us again on Fast Keto today. And if you enjoyed the episode, be sure to share it with someone that you think would enjoy the episode as well, and let us know what your takeaways were from this interview. Welcome, Dr. Ben Bikman. It's so great to have you back here on Fast Keto with us again for the third time. How are you this morning in Utah?
I am doing well, Vanessa. Thanks so much for the invitation. Wow, third time. Your listeners this will be their fill of me after this.
Well, you constantly keep coming up with new findings, and you're always sharing, really cutting edge research. So you're such a wonderful guest to have on the show, and you're so passionate about these topics. So I know that our audience really, really appreciates all that you have to share. And I've been loving watching some of your videos. You've been posting a lot more frequently. There was one, I think this week you did, which was really interesting, about fat metabolism. And I can tell you get really excited about a topic, and you can just go right on there and share it with everyone.
Well, thank you. Yeah, when it comes to fat, I never intended to be this great champion or defender, but I do think fat is, without a doubt, the most misunderstood and maligned of the macronutrients. And so I do make a point of wanting to sort of dispel some of the myth and rumor behind it.
Well, I know I first came to find your work when you started talking about protein. And I think that's how a lot of people in the keto space started finding your work, is you were explaining this insulin to glucagon ratio and how protein shouldn't be feared, and that, you were concerned that people were just drinking, these mugs full of oil and, MCT oil and butter and stuff. And your research really helped to clear things up. And I really want to get into the topic, especially of protein today. We're definitely going to talk about fat too. But I want to really dig into gluconeogenesis a little bit, because there's a lot of conflicting information. And I think that although we do understand for the most part that it's the synthesis of new glucose in the body, there's still, I think, a lot of misinformation, bad facts out there. So just to start off with, let's talk about gluconeogenesis. Do you think, in your opinion, it is more of a demand-driven process or supply-driven, or is it somewhere in between the two?
Yeah, no, I fall very firmly on the perspective that it is demand-driven. We aren't pushing this process. If it were the case, then someone would eat pure whey, one of the best proteins available, and they would have profound hyperglycemia as all those carbons are converted to glucose. But no, so I feel very strongly that it is demand driven. And then with regards to the role of protein in that demand, or supplying that demand, protein's role is much smaller than people think. If someone, I don't want to pull us into this yet too far, Vanessa, so I guess I'll just be brief in my comment, because I've already started. But if people look through some of the starvation studies that George Cahill did decades ago, and I just am enamored by George Cahill's work. I just would have loved to have met that man, and pick his brain. He found that the actual contribution, even in starvation, where you think that there's going to be a lot of gluconeogenesis, almost all of that gluconeogenesis, and the same thing happens in just a moderately fasted state, most of that gluconeogenesis is coming from lactate and pyruvate. Lactate itself is providing about half of all of that substrate and all of the building block for the liver to make new glucose. But there have been studies putting people into a fasted state and then giving them just protein, high protein meals. And the protein, only about 10% of that protein that they've consumed ends up contributing, or of the total amount of glucose made by the liver, so the total amount of gluconeogenesis, only 10% of it came from the protein. And this was even in a fasted state, having just eaten a big chunk of protein, a high protein meal. Even then, in this sort of optimal situation where you think the dietary protein would be used, you'd think all of it's going to be used for gluconeogenesis. But even in that optimal state of pushing gluconeogenesis, where the body's fasted, so liver glycogen's running on empty, and you've just given them a high protein meal, only 10% of all the new glucose came from that consumed protein. So protein is absolutely, the body is going to convert some of it, but it's not nearly as much as people think.
Yeah, I've seen work. I just had Dr. Donald Lehman on the show, and he was talking about how for about 100 grams of protein, you get about 60 grams of glucose from that. And I've never really heard it quantified in that way, but I thought that sort of, if that were the case, then that would kind of lend more to the supply driven, interpretation of gluconeogenesis. So I was curious as to your opinion on that.
Yeah. So I don't know him. I would, with all due respect, I'd be curious to see what he's basing that on. I imagine if he's being that specific, he probably does have some studies in mind. Those are not data that I've ever seen. From what I've seen, this is a demand-driven process, and there are explicit studies, like the two I've just mentioned from George Cahill's work, and then this far more recent study looking at short-term fasting and high-protein meals with tracer. Those are tracer studies. It would oppose that idea.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it was from some studies done in his lab at the university that he works with. So his career has been based on studying amino acids, and so it kind of changed the way that I thought a little bit about this from a biochemical perspective, is just looking at carbs and carbohydrates as fuel, and fats as hydrates of carbon as fuel, and not looking at protein as fuel, just looking at it as polymer chains of amino acids that our body breaks down and then is utilizing to repair our tissue, to make new enzymes, to make peptide-based hormones, all these things. So is it correct to think of the macronutrients in that way?
Yeah, I sure do. I absolutely think of it that way. I consider fat and carbs as fuel, and then protein as a building block. Now, that is not to say that the body can't use it. In one of the same studies I just mentioned, they found that there was a direct supply of amino acids from the diet into the citrate cycle. So this anaplerotic phenomenon of taking the amino acid and directly inserting it into the citrate cycle for energy. And that was about 15% of the consumed amino acids in this fasted state. So protein can be used as energy. There's no doubt about that. And I wouldn't want someone to think I'm saying otherwise. But it is not nearly to the degree that we see with glucose and fat. It's a very small portion of it being converted to energy, only in an energy deficit and glycogen depleted state.
Right. I guess the last kind of nagging question there would be, could it be due to the fact that it just takes such a long time to break the protein down, that it's happening over, say, 4 or 5 hours, as opposed to, carbs kind of hit the bloodstream really quickly? So it's just that it's a lengthier time?
That's a good question. I don't know. So in other words, is the protein being spared from being burned simply because it is so further back in the queue that the body never needs to get to it? I'm not sure. We would want to find studies where it compared rates of amino acid combustion or burning in states of infusion of amino acids versus dietary amino acids. That would perhaps answer some of that, but I don't know it.
Yeah. All right. Well, shifting over to fat a little bit, I want to talk about a video I mentioned earlier that you made talking about fat metabolism. So you talked about how actually in a low insulin state in the body, our metabolic rate is higher. So that's really interesting.
Oh yeah. That is actually based on studies from about 100 years ago, over 100 years ago now, with two just legends in the area of physiology, Joslin and Benedict at Harvard. And this is Joslin who wrote endocrinology, like the first endocrinology textbooks, and this is Francis Benedict, who created the first formulas to predict and very accurately measure metabolic rate based on the body and its dimensions and density. And what they found is that in type 1 diabetics, when type 1 diabetics, they had a metabolic rate that was higher than it should have been. And this was followed up with really good work in the 80s, where they found that at the very minute you give the type 1 diabetic insulin, metabolic rate just starts plummeting minute by minute. And it actually shifted by 300 calories. And what is so compelling about this is that not only do we see the same thing in type 2 diabetics, where once they begin insulin therapy, metabolic rate also drops. And that's relevant because the type 2 diabetic is already hyperinsulinemic. And now with the insulin therapy, we push them up even beyond to the super physiological insulin level, and it still depresses metabolic rate. But David Ludwig's work out of Harvard now, most recently, he found that they could shift the metabolic rate by about 280 calories per day based on whether they were giving them high carbohydrate meals, which depressed the metabolic rate by about 100 calories per day, or low carbohydrate meals, where it increased metabolic rate by 180 calories per day. So that shift, really close again to about 300 calories per day. And as I think I mentioned in that video, I occasionally do a stair stepper, not very often. I don't do a lot of aerobic exercise, but I note that it was around 300 calories is the number of calories it takes to stair step all the way to the top of the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world in Dubai. And I don't want to do that. I'd rather just keep my insulin in control and have that metabolic boost through that.
Yeah, it's fascinating because it kind of lines up with some of the other work and conclusions that you've drawn about the way that these macronutrients behave differently in the body depending on the insulin and glucagon ratios and where that, sort of fasting insulin is at. And it really shows how the higher your insulin is, it really starts to distort some of these natural processes. And, it's another reason why you want to keep insulin low, and having a keto diet or low carb diet where your energy sources are more so coming from fats, then carbs, really lends to creating that low insulin environment.
Yeah, insulin tells the body what to do with energy. That's when I try to reconcile the two theories of obesity, as has been very eloquently described in the past by Gary Taubes, the caloric idea that it's just purely calories in versus calories out, or the endocrine idea, which in its purity is that it's just all about insulin. To me, controlling insulin accounts for calories because insulin dictates what the body does with energy. Is it going to store it? If insulin is high, it will tell the body to store energy. And one of the ways it does that is by depressing metabolic rate. It is so determined to store as much energy as it can that it will signal the body to slow things down, even if it's a little, to help it store more. In contrast, if insulin is low, well, then the body is in energy use mode to the point that it's being so liberal with its energy use that it will accelerate metabolic rate.
That's beautiful. That totally makes sense. And it actually goes into my next question, which was another great point that you brought up in your video was talking about how if you're eating a lot of fat, you're going to be actually wasting energy through the ketones, the
Yep.
acetone that comes off the breath. So if I'd love to know more about that. And also, why does the body waste ketones? Like, why does it produce them?
Yeah, what a great question. So yeah, first of all, your point there about ketones being partially wasted, that is something I think is too infrequently invoked or described as a metabolic benefit to being in ketosis. But it is important and worth just briefly elaborating. When insulin is low, the body shifts fuel use, not only fuel rate or metabolic rate, but also fuel use. The body, being a bit of a hybrid engine, at any moment is predominantly burning either glucose or fat. And insulin, as it is relevant in everything energy, dictates that fuel use. And if insulin is elevated, then the body is in sugar or glucose burning mode. If insulin is depressed, then the body's in fat burning mode. And in fact, if insulin is depressed for sufficiently long, about a day, the body is burning so much fat that the liver actually is reached its maximum capacity of fat burning. That biochemical process that I've already mentioned and you're familiar with and your listeners are hearing too much of now already, the citrate cycle basically is running at full capacity, and that starts to inhibit the body, the liver cells themselves, from continuing to burn fat. And so, but it can't store it because insulin is low, and so it has created, there's this clever little biochemical outlet, and that is insulin is low, so we can't store the fat. We're burning fat at as much as we can, so we can't burn anymore, but we still are being told to continue to break it down. So then the liver starts shunting it into the ketogenic pathway. And ketones are energy, thank heavens, because the brain has such a demand for it in fasted states. And so it's important to know that ketones are nutrients. They are energetic molecules with roughly the same amount of calories as a carbohydrate has, but that also gives this outlet idea some relevance, because in ketosis, a person is breathing out ketones and they're urinating out ketones. And so this represents this kind of new character when it comes to balancing calories. We always say the calorie must be stored or used. Now we have this third one where we're just wasting them. We're just pushing them out of the body. Every breath we take or every time we're urinating, we get a little bit of ketones that are coming out there. And so that's a little bit of energy that was once a fat molecule that now we just dumped from the body.
And why do you think, from an evolutionary point of view, or why would the body waste ketones? Say someone is doing an extended fast and, you can see your ketones go up, 6, 7, 8 millimolar, I think is the highest I've ever seen. And you're just wondering, well, why is the body just I understand physiologically the mechanism is why it would happen, but why would we do that? Why would we be wasting it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can't have a firm answer. I can just speculate, but that's part of the fun, right? Yeah. In science, we can only ever answer how, and we can only speculate on the why. And I joke with my students that that's kind of a divine question, sort of asking why the body is built the way it is. So why might we be wasting ketones? Because that appears to be advantageous in our environment of this kind of hypercaloric environment, but ancestrally, it wouldn't make a lot of sense. I do think it's relevant to note that as someone is in ketosis more chronically, like weeks, that phenomenon plummets. So the actual excretion of acetone from the breath and the urine drops precipitously, and that's why people will commonly see, if they're in ketosis very long term, they will start to be upset or complain as they're measuring their ketones in their urine. They'll say, well, I'm doing everything I used to do, but my actual urinary excretion of ketones is much less than it used to be. The body actually starts to conserve more of that ketone to use. So if we look at it in a long-term perspective, I think our ancestors could have survived partly because we stop wasting the ketones. The body starts to become a little more thrifty.
It makes total sense considering how, adaptive our bodies are to basically anything we do, which is amazing. And it's so much intelligence at our cellular level. Now, I think knowing that you've studied fat, at such a deep level, and, white adipose and brown adipose, I'm curious if you have ever come across anything in particular with fat cells becoming diseased or sick, which is a situation that happens with lipedema. And there's a lot of people in the low carb and keto community, women especially, who have lipedema. And it's like this weird kind of like stubborn fat that women get that is just, I don't know if you've done much research yourself into sort of stubborn fat or fat cells that become diseased and why it becomes so difficult for women to lose that fat. And the only thing that seems to help is this kind of low carb approach. Keto, intermittent fasting, or longer fasting seems to be the only thing. And I don't know if it's the role of autophagy or if you could speculate there.
Yeah. I can speculate with a little bit of informed speculation, but definitely some speculation. So with lipedema, part of the problem is this fibrotic development. So fibroblasts, little like scarry tissue type cells coming into the fat tissue and disrupting the normal sort of layout of the fat, which is just happy little fat cells lumped together. You get these little kind of strands of fibrotic tissue separating it out. I don't know the degree to which that compromises fat loss at those same places. But so that's one idea just about with lipedema. But with regards to you mentioning stubborn fat, yes, certainly lipedema could be a part of that, because if you have fibrous tissue in that fat tissue, it might be more difficult to lose. But independent of that, there is an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. And lipoprotein lipase is the enzyme that dictates where we store fat and even how much. So a prime example of this is looking at a little boy and a little girl. When they're both little, they look the same, which is why I don't want my little boy to have long hair, because I don't want him to be confused with a little girl. But once he's a man, all right, fine, grow your hair out, enjoy it as long as you may have it, dear son of mine. But the little boy and the little girl start to grow, and then once they hit puberty, they start to look very different. Their bodies really start to change in very distinct ways. The little girl in particular starts to look like mom, and so she starts to put fat on her breasts and hips. And that is entirely a result of this expression of lipoprotein lipase. So that's just an example in human development of why we store fat. Now, so our sex is relevant there in where we have lipoprotein lipase, but also genetics. So if someone has like stubborn fat around, say, their arms or their ankles or their belly, wherever it may be, that is generally going to be a result of a lot of lipoprotein lipase at those specific sites. And then unfortunately, you can only manipulate that so much. Now, interestingly, insulin does increase lipoprotein lipase throughout the body. Exercise increases it in the muscle and reduces it in the fat, so there's benefits in you helping the body sort of train the body to move the fat where you want it a little bit. But if someone genetically has higher LPL in one site or another, that simply is the reality that'll be the last place the fat will come from or be burned, and it'll be the first place it goes back.
Yeah, it's interesting because I thought it was a fat-burning enzyme.
Yeah. So lipoprotein lipase is the enzyme that simply breaks down the fat as it's passing through in the blood and pulls it into the fat cells, or whatever the cell is that we have this little capillary bed going through. So like I said, if you exercise, you increase lipoprotein lipase in the muscle, and so then it's just the muscle is pulling in more to burn. Or if insulin is elevated, then you increase this enzyme in the fat tissue. And again, it's just simply breaking off pieces of fat as it's circulating on lipoproteins and then bringing it in to be stored or burned.
Great. It's super interesting because I know a lot of people deal with stubborn fat that they weren't able to resolve on anything else except, for keto. And then it goes back to the lowering insulin, which happens so well on low carb and keto. And it seems to fit so nicely together.
Yeah, in fact, it does. I agree. In fact, let me just mention my whole very slow acceptance or embrace, rather, of a low carbohydrate diet comes from the perspective of insulin. As an insulin resistance scientist, I have a deep appreciation for the necessity and the pathology of insulin and it being chronically elevated. And I was just as much an opponent of a low carbohydrate diet as anyone historically. And it really was this evolution of me appreciating the relevance of insulin resistance in disease, the causes of insulin resistance, with chronically high insulin being a big one, not the only one, but a big one. And then appreciating that the best way to lower insulin is by scrutinizing the amount and types of carbohydrates and being more liberal with protein and fat. And it was a painful evolution, but it was one that was built completely on the published literature. The evidence is clear. When you compare a low-carb diet to a low-fat diet, the low-carb diet will lower insulin about 3 or 4 times more than the low-fat diet will.
That's great. Now, knowing that you came to this conclusion from all the research that you've done, I'm really curious what your opinion is on the protein to fat ratios and, where is kind of that optimal level in your opinion for people who want to, really recompose their bodies to have lower fat, higher lean mass, stronger bones, just more muscle.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on all the debate that goes on there?
Yeah. Of course, I have an opinion on that. There is some evidence to show that when protein and fat is kept in a 1-to-1 ratio, it is optimal. So a lot of the classic, I shouldn't say classic because they're not that old, but a lot of the studies from these really well-known kind of low-carb ketogenic diet labs like Volek and Finney's work, a lot of the diets that they'd put people on, when you look at the breakdown of macronutrients, it's about 30% protein and 65-ish, 60 to 70%, well, 60 to 65% fat. And that ends up by mass being a 1-to-1. And I don't think that's an accident. Many cuts of meat are a 1-to-1 ratio of protein to fat by mass. Eggs, which I consider one of the most nutritious and perfectly packaged foods on the planet, eggs are 1-to-1 by mass. And so I think we see this reflected in nature, but also some really neat clinical studies have confirmed this. Even when you look at something like muscle protein synthesis, which is typically used to measure the effect of a dietary protein, there was a study done that gave these study subjects just pure egg whites and then looked at the degree of muscle protein synthesis. And then they gave them a comparable amount of egg white but matched with the egg yolk, so this 1-to-1 of protein and fat. And it actually amplified the muscle protein synthesis. So it was significantly better when protein and fat were mixed together. So I believe that has a relevance not only for athletes, but even more importantly for those of us that are getting older, and we need to make sure we're getting enough protein used by the body, incorporated into the body to maintain lean mass just to stay healthy. And like you said before, there's far more relevance to dietary protein than just lean mass like muscles and bones, although even the bones are often overlooked as having a high demand for protein. But like you'd said, most of the enzymes in the body come from proteins, from amino acids. Most second messengers within every cell, when a cell is doing its business, many of those second messengers within the cell are coming from protein as well. So we have a lot of demand for protein in various ways, and fat simply helps the body use it better.
It's really interesting because you kind of look at fat, there's essential fatty acids, although there's quite a small requirement for them, but the fact that they have this synergistic effect together is really interesting.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. And that is important even when we look at nutrition. There are such things as essential fats. There are such things as essential amino acids, no such thing as essential carbohydrate. So let's focus on the two we know are essential. Not that we don't eat any carbohydrates, but don't let that be the bulk of the calories when they're unnecessary.
I'm curious if you think that people can still be in a state of ketogenesis if they're eating higher levels of protein, and when I say higher, to quantify that, I mean closer to the 1-to-1 ratio, which is more of a 35 to 65 distribution. A lot of traditional ketogenic diets really restrict and limit protein quite a bit. So people who are eating more protein in our space especially fear doing that. Before it was the mTOR and the insulin fears, we kind of resolved that, but there's this fear of, you're not going to be in ketogenesis anymore, but on low carb and keto, your glycogen stores naturally are lower, so you're going to be going in the post-absorptive state quicker, and then you're probably eating less frequently throughout the day, maybe 2 meals a day, 1 meal a day. So
Yeah.
What do you think people should fear not being in ketosis anymore?
Yeah, what a great question. My thought on that is that we don't do this. We shouldn't be doing this to chase ketones. And ketones, as we mentioned earlier, actually become increasingly less reliable as someone's more in ketosis long term, partly because the body starts using them more. And we certainly start excreting them less. So depending on how the person's measuring their ketones, even if it's in the blood, the body starts using the ketones more. So there's this more equalizing of the production of the ketones and the use of the ketones. So yeah, I think we shouldn't be chasing ketones. But even still, the protein is so essential to maintaining, if not increasing, lean mass. But also, it is worth mentioning that if someone is eating protein with carbohydrate, with a very readily digestible glucose, or they have hyperglycemia already, then there is a significant insulin spike from the protein. Mm-hmm. Now, the degree to which the person should fear the protein, I don't know. I don't want to say that should be justification for fearing the protein, but there is a huge difference in insulin response, well, at least statistically significant, and I would argue meaningful difference in insulin response to amino acids based on whether the person is in hyperglycemia, in other words, ample glucose around, or glucose is low and they're glycogen depleted. Then there's a much smaller insulin effect, insignificant almost.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting in Dr. Michael Ead's book. He had one graph showing the different macronutrient combinations, and there was just one combination that had the highest insulin response, which was low protein, high carb, high fat, and that tends to be where all of our fast food, pizza, burgers and fries, all of that is just this really hyperinsulinogenic food.
Yep. In fact, that is a very important thing for me as a father. As I allow my children to have a certain amount of snack, packaged foods, of course, it's hard to avoid. And I wouldn't want to deprive them of some of that enjoyment. I enjoyed it when I was a kid. But I am mindful, and I mention, all right, you've had that little handful or little bowl of goldfish crackers, which is like meth for kids. That's all they would eat. That's all they'd eat if they could. But I'll tell them, look, we need to get some protein, because I don't know of any packaged, processed, readily consumed foods that are high in protein. So as much as I am an advocate and defender of fat, when it comes to packaged foods, it's really the absence of protein that worries me when I look at the indulgences that my kids are allowed to have.
I think it's a great point. And, kids obviously can get away with eating more carbs and still build a lot of muscle. It's when you're older that you have to really prioritize the protein and keep carbs low, and especially make sure that you get enough protein. I'm curious, turns out that our cells actually do quite a bit of protein recycling, and protein turnover is estimated somewhere between 200 to 300 grams. So if all that protein recycling is happening at the cellular level, why do you think we still need to take in exogenous protein every day?
What a great question. I don't know, actually. I would just speculate that in that turnover, it can't be thermodynamically perfect. That every time you turn something over, you lose something. It is that reality of the universe. And so as efficient as the cell is probably attempting to be at breaking down a protein into its component amino acids and building it back up, you're always going to lose some. And so that then creates the need for exogenous protein.
Yeah, that's exactly. I think it just you need to add in those extra amino acids so they come in. Now, tell us about your new book that I think is available for pre-order right now.
Yeah, it is. Well, thank you for mentioning it. Yeah, it is a strange step in a very commercial direction for me. In the world of academia, it's very pure, and people love you for the purity. And I hope I don't make any enemies now that I have a book. But the book is Why We Get Sick. It's available for pre-order anywhere books are sold, and it's essentially a very easy to read textbook on emphasis on easy to read. Good figures, very clearly written, very accessibly written. But it's about insulin resistance, and it defines what is insulin resistance, why does it matter, and so I spend a good portion of the book going through and detailing the research that indicates that insulin resistance is really a backbone to virtually every non-infectious chronic disease. Alzheimer's disease, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian syndrome in women, or erectile dysfunction in men, and so many more. Many of them are totally built on insulin resistance, or insulin resistance is making it worse. So that's the part about why it matters. And then the last section is what to do about it. And I go through the evidence indicating what a person can do to improve their insulin sensitivity and start to fight that insulin resistance. So yeah, it's Why We Get Sick. The more people that buy it and read it, truly, I do think the healthier we're going to be. But it is really my attempt at crystallizing all the thoughts and all the talks I've ever given about insulin resistance, and just say, look, the more we keep ignoring insulin resistance, the worse we're going to be treating chronic diseases. And maybe in some instances, the worse we will be detecting it. We won't detect it until it's much later. If we looked at insulin resistance, we could detect problems sooner and treat the problems better.
That's great. I use your quote in my presentations, and it's about how metabolic health is the root of all modern non-infectious chronic disease. And that's a unified theory that we really need people to understand, that, that's why keto and low carb it's looked at, well, it's this panacea for everything. Well, that's because it's all metabolically rooted. And the more people understand that, the healthier we can be.
Yep, that's exactly right.
As a society. I also wanted to ask you about a new project you're working on, which is called is it HLTH?
Yeah, Get Health. Yeah. So that's a clever way of just making health into something a little more provocative. Yeah. So thanks. So it was this idea we talked about just a moment ago, how the best evidence shows that this macronutrient mix of 1-to-1 protein to fat, while being very judicious with carbohydrates, really improves metabolic health and, by extension, overall health. And so with some other people in the nutrition field, I developed, in fact, it's the shake you can see back there, the shake, Complete Meal. And the name of the company is Health Code. And so I formulated the product, and then I'm a co-founder in the company, and it's available directly for sale online at gethealth.com. Not in your neck of the woods, though. It's just available for order in the U.S. currently. But yeah, I hope everyone listening by all means, give it a try if you're curious. I think it's the best. I think it's the best thing out there. Beyond the macronutrients, there's digestive focus, a collagen focus, a little bit of apple cider vinegar, and a lot of other things. I think people really get a kick out of it.
Is it a meal replacement, kind of convenient?
It is. Mm-hmm. It is a meal replacement. It is not meant to be just a protein shake. Although, given the 1-to-1 mix of protein and fat, it does help the protein work better. But it's the best proteins: whey and egg whites, mostly fruit fats with a little bit of grass-fed ghee. But it's olive, coconut fat, and a few more. It's great. It's awesome, actually. I'm really proud of it.
I can't wait to check it out. It sounds fantastic, and like a lot of high quality ingredients going into it. And it's so hard to find convenience foods that we all need that are actually healthy. So that sounds like a really great product.
Yeah.
Just as we wrap up, I'd love to get your final thoughts on what is the best combination for fat loss and body composition. I know we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, and also just the 1-to-1 ratio, but there's a lot of emphasis and talk now about, like Dr. Ted Naiman talking about how if you have body fat to lose, you should pretty much try to minimize your intake of exogenous fat as much as possible. But then there's this other camp, paleomedicina, and a lot of high fat advocates who say, like, you basically need to have the fat in there for several reasons we talked about, like to keep insulin low so that you can be in this low insulin environment, so that you're not just overeating protein. What are your thoughts on the best route and strategy for people to take if they want to optimize burn body fat and lose weight?
Yeah. What a great question. I do think that if someone is seeking weight loss, active weight loss, that means they need to be cognizant of the fat they're eating, or just the total amount of calories. I'm not saying they need to be counting their calories, but I would say that to me is an instance where they shouldn't be adding pure fat to like their coffee. So I always say, I kind of developed these 3 cheeky, memorable pillars some time ago. Control carbohydrates, so keep them very minimum and a high nutritious value to starch content, so as little starch and sugars as possible in those fruits and vegetables. Prioritize protein, getting that 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body mass, or ideal body mass if they're trying to lose 50 pounds, put it at that lower level, and then fill the rest of the calories with fat. That I have just seen this work too many times, including a case study we published just last year, where we did not instruct these women to lower their fat. It was be liberal with the fat, but get the fat in natural sources. And nature has fat come with protein. There's just almost no exception except for the fatty fruits. So I shouldn't say almost. The fatty fruits, coconuts, avocados, what's the other one? Olives. Those are the ones that where it's fatty fruit. Enjoy them because it's coming from a natural source. And in those instances, it's coming with some fiber. But fat comes with protein. And so eat it that way. And then just be smart about the carbohydrates. But I don't think, I'm definitely more fat friendly in that regard, because as you mentioned, when you look across the macronutrients, fat is the macronutrient with the least effect on insulin. And indeed, in low levels, it has no effect on insulin up until the point of someone consuming, you have to consume like 500 calories of pure fat to get an insulin bump. And then even then, while it becomes statistically significant, it is still really small, certainly compared to the other macronutrients. And that's why I'm much more friendly towards dietary fat.
And is that mostly because we don't need insulin to be able to store fat because it can cross the cellular membranes? We don't need sort of this insulin there to unlock these transporters and unlock the cell?
Yeah, that's an excellent observation. Yes, the fatty acid transporters are insulin independent. There's no insulin requirement for fat uptake. And in fact, in some instances, the same goes with amino acid transporters, although there is in some ways an insulin effect there as well. But yeah, that's right. Yeah, we don't need a big insulin bump for the body to store the fat. It can do that well. Although, again, if insulin is low, it simply won't. As much as it'll be pulling in fat, it'll also be breaking fat down. And so we've just simply increased the turnover.
Yeah, I think it's just amazing that, like you said, when we eat sort of animal proteins or eggs, in their natural state, they come with those perfect ratios that actually tend to be somewhat, that tend to be low carb, that are sort of keto, 65 to 35. And that's the way we should be eating the food. It's when you start concocting things and adding things, to your coffee and doing these unusual behaviors that you're going to probably get, maybe.
And I think some of those unusual behaviors stem from an obsession with ketones. Right. When you're chasing ketones, you're thinking, I'm going to just add MCT to everything because it's ketogenic. It is, absolutely, but you're just, it ends up being a net negative effect potentially.
It's like people drinking or eating, MCT oil to burn fat, and that it's been just a huge negative in the keto space because people don't realize that it has a caloric value. It is energy, and you're taking it in, and it's not going to put you into this magical fat burning state.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Well, Dr. Bikman, Ben, thank you so much for being here again with us today. Is there any sort of final thoughts you want to leave with our listeners?
No, Vanessa, thanks so much for the opportunity. Anyone who's curious, my involvement on social media is generally just to share the latest published science on human metabolism, and I'm pretty active on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
And everyone can find you just by searching Ben Bikman.
Yep. Not a lot of Bikmans in the world. Bikman. They'll find me.
Great. Well, we'll definitely put the links to pre-order your new book, to check out the Get Health project that you're working on. And thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us and sharing all your insight and expertise with our listeners.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I had a great time.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for tuning into the episode today with Ben. It was so fantastic to have him on the show again. And I'm so honored anytime we get to have him on the show. He has such incredible insight, expertise, and knowledge on these topics that we are all so interested in. And I'm just absolutely thrilled that we got to have him back on the show today. So hope you guys enjoyed the episode. And if you liked it, hit the subscribe button, share the episode with someone that you like. Take a moment to leave me a rating or review. It absolutely makes my day whenever I get a new rating or review, and it means the absolute world to me. It enables me to be able to do more of these episodes, bring on more great guests, and share more resources with all of you. So until the next episode, I really hope you guys are taking care out there. If you want to try keto with me as your coach and guide, you can head over to ketogenicgirl.com. I just put up the pre-order link recently to my new carnivore meal plans. If you want to do keto carnivore, I have what's called the phase 2 higher protein plans, which are available now, and you can get those at any time. It's the phase 2 higher protein plans, and those are keto carnivore, sort of carnivore adjacent. They're really effective for recomposing your body composition to having less fat, more lean mass and muscle. And the carnivore plans, like I said, are available for pre-order. All the programs come with my support and coaching in our members coaching group. So I would love to help you get the results that you're looking for and work with you. You can go over and check those out at www.ketogenicgirl.com. And until the next episode, I'm wishing you a fat-filled rest of your day. Bye for now.